Something you hear a lot about in the aftermath of World War II is all of the horrible war crimes committed by the Soviet Union against German civilians, citizens, Nazi sympathizers, prisoners of war. And then a lot of that took place in Berlin, like immediately after the Red Army won. And the question I always wondered is, why were there even people in Berlin in 1945 when it was obvious that the war was lost, that the Soviets were just around the corner? Why did people stay? But more on that in a moment. Hello friends, my name is Michael McCauley. This is History for Thinkers. In this episode, we are going to be discussing why people were still in Berlin in 1945. Without any further ado, let's get right in to the episode. The German people are really such a fascinating bunch. I mean, the history of Germany is just so crazy. And if we want to understand where this generation of Germans are at this point, right, around 1945, the end of World War II, we need a quick little history lesson. So as a collective society, these people have suffered through the autocracy and all the horrible things associated with the Kaiser, right? Living under a really regressive regime, which not as bad as the Nazis, but still pretty bad. Then, of course, because that autocracy makes such horrible decisions, they get into World War I, and they are the main supporter of these Central Powers. So they contribute the most men, they have the most death, and just suffering all around the board, right? Because especially they're tied down with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is kind of regressive, kind of a goofy little empire. They don't contribute nearly as much as Germany does. And on top of that, there's also the Ottomans who, I mean, they were just dead weight in World War I. So it was pretty bad for Germany. When you're the one competent person playing on your team, it gets kind of rough. So that all goes down, which, I mean, that was just horrible to have gone through, especially because the autocracy and the Kaiser, well, they basically bet the entire civilization on winning that war. They put everything down, and we can discuss more on that later, but they basically set themselves up for horrible economics after World War I, in the scenario that they lost, which they did. So hyperinflation sets in, they're in crazy debt, the entire society is just downtrodden. People don't have anything at that point. And then there's this post-war situation with France, where they didn't have enough money to pay France back, so France just comes in and starts taking stuff, which was a horrible hit to morale. And I mean, they even had colonial troops come in, so you can just imagine what it would have felt like to have been a 20th century German. You have the worst war defeat in your nation's history. Like the worst one, by far, not even close up to that point. And then you get occupied by, sub-Saharan Africans under the French flag. I mean, if you wanted to find a way to antagonize Europeans in that point more, I don't think you could find a more infuriating thing to do. So while all that's going on, they're trying to understand how to have a republic, voting, having a democracy, political parties, and that just wasn't working out because things were so bad. The presiding government, no matter who was voted in, things just got worse. And that really wasn't the fault of the people in the German government at the time, and to an extent, right? But when you really look at the situation, there was just not a whole lot that they could do, realistically. And by the time you get to the late 1920s, the 1930s, when the Nazis started seeing a lot more support, I think by that point, the German people, they were just we've been trying, center of the road politics and, regular conservatives and regular liberals for a long time now. And let's just try something new. I think that was a lot of the motivation. Let's see what happens. It can't get any worse. So they tried something new, and it did in fact get worse, oddly enough, surprisingly enough. And they find themselves in this horrible Second World War, which, again, you can't even fathom how much suffering was going on collectively. So these German people, this generation, they've lived through all of this. So, I can't ever quantify what that does to a national psyche. No one ever can. But you just have to imagine that it played some kind of role. So a couple years into World War II, 1942, it's obvious that the Germans are going to lose. Their big offensive, the Operation Barbarossa, completely failed. It was supposed to be a fast victory. And when you don't have that quick, speedy victory like you did in France and the Low Countries, well, when that doesn't happen and it's years later and your military is still in Russia, it's kind of like, why didn't we have the fast victory that, Hitler was talking about? And of course, the Nazis don't have the best relationship with reality, so there's no way that they can admit defeat when their offensive obviously failed. They just expected, yeah, if we keep fighting, we'll eventually win. And what that really meant was it's going to be a slow, miserable grind until Germany is destroyed. And it's really in the late years of World War II, that's when the worst crimes of the Holocaust and all, the crazy genocide that went on. That's when that gets really bad. Because there is nothing more dangerous than a political extremist regime that knows it's about to lose a war. Nothing in the world more dangerous than that. I think if you wanted to make a really accurate comparison, think about someone that gets some kind of terminal illness, let's say cancer. And this person, they know they're gonna die. And let's say they had some kind of grudge against someone they truly hated deep down. If this guy's got 6 months left to live, you can bet that he is going to seek revenge before he dies. And that is exactly what Germany was doing at the end of World War II. These political extremists, these crazy people, they were going to just kill everyone that they could. And this is where we get the whole idea of totalen Krieg. That is German for total war, and it basically meant the entire society is going to be mobilized for war. You are either going to contribute to this war effort, or you are going to be enslaved to contribute to the war effort. Whether you are a woman, a child, a baby barely of age, it doesn't matter what it is. Even if you can't fight on the front lines, you are going to be working in the factories. You're going to be contributing in some way, shape, or form. And on some level, can you even really blame them? World War I was probably the most traumatic event to happen in German history up to that point, right? Because I think living under the Nazi regime and World War II was way worse. But at that point, they didn't know that. So they could just think back to how horrible it was with World War I, and they basically said, you know what? I don't want to relive that. No one wants to relive the horror of World War I, so let's just keep on going. If we fight harder, if we put more of our back into it, maybe something might give. So in the Nazi leadership, the basic idea was that total destruction was preferable to admitting defeat. Now that is one thing if you are the Führer and you can just commit suicide when the consequences of your actions show up outside your door. It's really easy to want total destruction when you can just do that and not have to suffer. When you are the people on the ground that have to live with the consequences of those actions, well, it's a completely different story now, isn't it? So if you want the TLDR, the quick answer, the reason the German people didn't all flee Berlin is because the Nazis established the People's Court. You weren't allowed to leave Berlin. And this People's Court was presided over by Roland Freisler, a Nazi jurist, and he was an interesting fellow. So on top of being a complete Nazi ideologue, he was the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury all in one. So yeah, you could totally bet that there were going to be fair and balanced trials. I mean, he was the kind of guy that he would berate the defendants for their crimes. Things that they weren't even really proven to have done. I mean, you just have to imagine you get accused of something like defeatism, you're not being nationalistic enough. You get sent to this court, the prosecutor, judge, and jury, this Roland Friesler guy, basically berates you for being a loser and not dedicated enough, and then you get executed. That's what was going on in Berlin in 1945. And this Friesler guy, and I apologize for mispronouncing his name. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. I know. You don't have to tell me in the comments. But he was just this insane guy, because he went to the Soviet show trials back in 1938 when Stalin was really cementing his regime in place, killing any opposition, anyone that could possibly challenge him. And he goes to these Soviet show trials and he watches them. And he says, you know what? This is really smart. We should do this in our country. Now, I just want you, really think about that just for a minute. Imagine seeing Soviet show trials where innocent people, decent Soviet people, citizens and military personnel and whatnot, these people are accused of a horrible crimes. They admit to them. And then they have some of the worst executions and torturing and imprisonment, like some of the worst stuff you can imagine happen to you. Now imagine the kind of person that sees that and says, you know what? The world needs more of this. Our country should be doing this. Think about that. That is the person who is the judge in this people's court in Berlin. That is insane. That blows my mind. And here's an interesting side note on how Friesler died. So he was presiding over a trial when the Allies started bombing the building, and he began to flee to a nearby bomb shelter. Or, well, at least everyone else did. Well, he stayed to try to grab more files because he wanted to continue court, right? Like, let's get all the files, let's get everyone, let's get to safety, and then we can continue this thing. Well, one of the files he was holding was the file on Fabian von Schlabrendorf. I'm sorry again, mispronunciation, I know. Well, Friesler died because a bomb came in, got him, a column fell on him, and Fabian lived to see another day. Well, the weird poetic justice of the situation is that Fabian was also a jurist, and he became a judge for the Constitutional Court of the Federal Republic of Germany after the war. So years later, he gets to be one of these kind of big-time judges for Germany. And it's just really interesting to think about because, well, had the Allies not been bombing the court at that exact moment, this Fabian guy probably would not have lived. He probably would have died. So let's talk a little bit about this people's court. The death sentence was the standard punishment. Once you were basically established to be guilty, or Friesler said you were guilty, you were you're pretty much killed. No presumption of innocence. You had to prove yourself, prove basically to Friesler that you were innocent, you didn't do it, that you're a good, patriotic Nazi citizen, and you promise that it won't ever happen again. So what are some of these typical offenses going on? Really simple things, and things that are very subjective. So participating in black markets, trying to feed your family, trying to, keep things going. People aren't trading cocaine or whatever. People are trying to trade things to live. This is 1945, 1944, Berlin, Germany. They're not trading luxury goods. It's not Cuban cigars being passed around. It's, I need to feed my dying children kind of goods. So work slowdowns. So if you're not working as vigorously as you used to because your caloric intake is a third of what it was last year, well, you get killed for that. And then this extremely subjective and horrible phrase that got thrown around, defeatism. So defeatism is accepting defeat without putting up a fight. And Hitler in particular hated that. Even going back to World War I. Now, understandably, there were cases where people gave up way too easily. Right? What are you doing, man? You pulling a French on me? Pulling a Frenchie on me? Well, at this point, this is late stage World War II. If you are a defeatist German, you just acknowledge what's going on. There's no way this war is turning around. No way in hell that it is going to be turned around. So, I mean, being a defeatist, like you're connected with reality. You accept the situation for what it is. So having a good relationship with reality got you killed in late stage Berlin. And this also included things like trying to leave. If you were trying to flee Berlin, all the chaos, the impending war crimes by the Red Army, you're just going to be killed because you're a defeatist. You're giving up. So we don't have exact numbers, but somewhere between 7,000 and 18,000 people were sentenced. Over 5,000 German citizens were executed. I mean, that's just horrible. 5,000 of your own people. 5,000, probably a lot more, right? This is probably not a 100% accurate number. This is only an estimate. But, I mean, you just have to think about that, man. These are Berlin German citizens who were free up until that point. So, like, people that were probably fairly supportive of this horrible regime. And they're getting killed by it because, well, they don't want to be tortured when the Soviets come marching in and destroy Berlin. And I think this is where you can really see the irony of Nazi Germany. The state, the terrorist state, that claimed that it was fighting for the German people, that above all, that is what we are serving. That is our goal, to help and preserve and protect the German people. Well, here they are at the end of World War II, executing Germans for being defeatist, for accepting the loss of a war that was definitely lost. Filthy hypocrites. And the Germans that weren't killed in this people's court, well, they were forced to endure foreign military occupation of the most hated enemy on earth. I mean, not just from an ideological standpoint, but I mean, the Germans and the Russians, they didn't have the best relationship at the point, especially because of all the Wehrmacht war crimes going on in Russia and, all those Slavic countries in between them. So there was just this real animosity, and now the Soviets were going to come and take their revenge. That is just, again, I cannot emphasize how horrible it must have been to have been a German citizen living in Berlin under these circumstances. And then if you somehow manage to live through all of this horror, you had to live under communism. That's your great reward for staying alive. So why didn't more Germans flee Berlin in 1945? Because the regime that claimed to be fighting for their right to live was going to kill them if they fled. This has been History for Thinkers. My name is Michael McCauley. Thank you so much for listening all the way through. I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.
Mm-hmm.